Imagine creating an empire of technology, innovating the most influential gateways through the technology world. The life of Steve Jobs was incredibly unpredictable. Jobs was superbly smart, constantly learning, yet still dropped out of college. While Jobs was creating an empire in his garage, he never lost sight of those that mattered to him.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
In his early days, Jobs had an abundance of impacts that made him who he is today. For example, when Jobs was born, his mom decided to give him up for adoption.
Jobs always knew he was adopted, but it still had a profound effect on him. He told Isaacson this story from his early childhood during one of their many taped interviews.
Now, I remember right here on the lawn telling Lisa McMoyler, who lived across the street, that I was adopted. And she said, "So, does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" Ooh, lightning bolts in my head. I remember running into the house. I think I was probably crying, asking my parents, and they sat me down. They said, "No, you don't understand." They said, "We specifically picked you out."
He said, from then on, I realized that I was not just abandoned. I was chosen. I was special. And I think that's the key to understanding Steve Jobs.
While in college, Jobs did some engrossing things that would be looked down upon from any successful person in America. He dropped out of college so he could drop into classes that looked more interesting. Most people would see this indicated him to waste his money in college, but he didn't drop his classes for any ordinary reason. He took calligraphy and speech for coding and talking to people. These classes that he chose to take instead of his core classes were very beneficial to the business that he was soon to open up. He also took social dance so he could meet girls. Some people may not believe it, but he was like any other man and wanted a social life, so he had multiple girlfriends. Around that time, he met his partner, Steve Wozniak. Wozniak and Jobs were both geniuses, which led to the invention of the Apple I.
That you owned, it was your prized possession, and you sold it to develop...
Oh, I sold my Hewlett-Packard scientific calculator for $500.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yes, and Dave Evans, he never, I think that was his name, he never never showed up to pay me the other half. But that's okay because, you know, I didn't care. I'm not the sort of person who was going to chase him down and pursue it anyway. I just don't do that with money.
No.
Woz was the brains for the coding and engineering of the computers, and Jobs was the business aspect of Apple. Jobs and Woz were marketing geniuses.
No, my point is it's amazing that Apple started from you selling your calculator and getting $250
and Steve sold his
cash.
van, and that money was just to put into a product that we knew was extremely short-term and not real. It was the Apple I computer, but we were showing off the Apple II before we ever shipped an Apple I, and the Apple II we knew was the big computer. I designed it as a computer from the ground up, and the Apple I had modified something else very quickly. It wasn't really the intent to make the great computer.
Just when you would think that these two had something great going for them, tragedy hit. It seemed as if their luck had run out on them, and their products weren't selling as much as they were hoping. Their products had failed and they had nowhere to go. This is the point in time where the company decided to fire Jobs.
The board of Apple essentially pushed Steve Jobs out of the company that he founded back in the 80s, and you've called that the darkest hour of your professional life. Explain what you mean.
Well, I was brought into Apple at a time when the Apple III had failed. The Apple II was the only cash generator in the company. It was outsold by Atari and Commodore, each by 2 to 1. And the company needed cash flow in order to give time for Steve to create the Macintosh and then to launch the Macintosh. I didn't know anything about computers. I was brought in because I knew something about marketing. And so we kept the Apple II alive for 3 more years. I was also brought in to help bring in consumer advertising. Pepsi Generation and Pepsi Challenge were experience-centric advertising themes. So Steve and I were totally aligned on those 2 ideas. Where it broke down was in 1985, the Macintosh Office, which is what we called it at that time, was just not powerful enough. The processor technology just wasn't there yet to be able to really be a functioning tool the way Steve had envisioned. And our disagreement was over Steve wanting to lower the price of the Macintosh, and I said that we had to leave the price of the Macintosh alone because we couldn't build any more even if we could sell them, and that we had to focus on the Apple II. And Steve didn't want to focus on the Apple II. He wanted to focus on the Mac. We went to the board. The board did an investigation for several weeks, came back and agreed with my position and asked Steve to step down from running the Macintosh division. You can imagine what an incredible blow it was to the founder of the company, the largest shareholder, the chairman of the board, to be told to step down from the Macintosh division. And Steve never got over that. In hindsight, it was a terrible mistake for Steve to be pushed out. I clearly was not skilled in being able to build technology products, so I had to surround myself with others, and the reality was there was no one ever as good as Steve. When I left Poppy, Apple did become the largest selling PC in the world. It had $2 billion of cash, and it had grown 1,000% on the top line. But I think would have been an even better company if if the board and I had figured out a way to keep Steve there.
After this awful tragedy, they made a very wise decision. They decided that it was crucial to have Jobs back on the team. After they had Jobs back on the team, they were back in their groove and making successful products. This is when they began to immerse as a huge impact on the technology world. No one could keep up with them, and their products were outstanding. Little did the company know, whenever Jobs came back, he also brought many ideas with him. These ideas are the reason why their products became so successful. With his ideas, he also brought a new and improved leadership aspect about himself. This is another reason why his run with the company was much more successful the second go-around than the first. Though the company had many triumphs the second go-around, in 1997, Apple suffered a significant crisis with their financial management. Bill Gates, the CEO of Microsoft, came to the rescue by investing $150 million into Apple.
All of this led to the biggest tragedy of all, which was the death of Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was diagnosed with cancer and decided to resign a few years before his death.